I'm Joel Chandler. Welcome to another episode of Unsealed. In most episodes, I take you behind the scenes for a look at various open government projects that I'm working on, or we discuss issues relating to open government in Florida. But occasionally, we take time to talk about what happens when authority operates in the shadows. In those episodes, we tell stories that remind us why government transparency matters. That's what we're going to do today. So let me tell you a story about the state of Florida operating what was, for all intents and purposes, a concentration camp for children for 111 years. And the politicians? They knew. They always knew. This is the story of the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, though it went by many names during its dark history: the Florida State Reform School, the Florida Industrial School for Boys. Different names, same nightmare, a place where children, some as young as 8 years old, though most were older, were beaten, assaulted, tortured, worked as slaves, and died at the hands of the very people who were supposed to protect them. And here's what's going to make you absolutely furious. From day one, practically from the moment this institution opened its doors on January 1st, 1900, the state of Florida knew exactly what was happening. Politicians toured the facility, investigators filed damning reports, newspaper headlines screamed about the abuse, and what did they do? Nothing. They changed the name and allowed the abuse to continue. Today we're diving deep into this story of human depravity that operated a stone's throw from Florida's state capital for over a century. We're going to talk about how children were leased out as agricultural laborers, because yes, this was designed as a free child labor operation from the very beginning. We're going to examine how investigation after investigation found horrific abuse and how politicians just shrugged and let it continue. And we're going to honor the survivors, the men known as the White House Boys, who finally forced the world to pay attention. The year was 1897, when the Florida legislature passed an act to create what they called a reform school. But let's be crystal clear about what this really was from the start. This was a child slavery operation dressed up in humanitarian clothing. The school opened on 1,400 acres in Marianna, Florida on New Year's Day, 1900. Right from the beginning, they divided the campus into two sections, the white side and the colored side, because even in their cruelty, they had to maintain their precious segregation. But here's the thing that should make every decent human being sick to their stomach. In 1903, just 3 years after the school opened, investigators were already finding children chained in leg irons like common criminals. Their report said this was no reform school. This was a prison for children. Did Florida shut it down? Absolutely not. They changed the superintendent and kept the nightmare going. Now let's talk about what this place really was: a profit-making enterprise built on the backs of enslaved children, because that's exactly what it was. The school wasn't designed to reform anybody. It was designed to provide free labor to the state and private companies. Research by genealogist and peonage specialist Antoinette Harrell uncovered the financial records that tell the real story. Kids as young as 7 years old were forced to work the fields, growing sweet potatoes, butter beans, string beans, turnips, okra. They raised and slaughtered livestock. They cut timber in dangerous swamps. They made bricks, all without pay. And the money? Sales records show that in March 1966, Dozier made $118,160 in swine sales and $156,108 in beef sales for that year. That's over $2 million in today's money. The produce was loaded onto trucks every day and sold for sizable profits. Companies were literally profiting off child slave labor, and the state of Florida was collecting the checks. One survivor, Johnny Lee Gaddy, told Harrell about cutting timber in the swamps when he was just 11 years old. "I saw the trucks coming and going," he said. Children working, trucks leaving with their labor, money flowing to the state, and it was a system, pure systematic torture. Children working, trucks leaving with their labor, money flowing to the state. It was an assembly line of exploitation. At the center of this nightmare stood a building that would become synonymous with terror, a concrete block structure the boys called the White House. Not because it was painted white, but because of the horror that happened inside its walls. This is where children were taken for what the state euphemistically called discipline. What really happened was torture, pure, systematic torture. Listen to survivor Robert Straley describe what happened to him in 1967. I was taken to the White House around 2 in the morning. They threw me on a blood-stained mattress, tied my feet to the bed frame, and began beating me with a leather strap attached to a wooden handle. The strap was industrial-grade leather, weighted, designed to inflict maximum damage. The bed frame was metal, specifically chosen so the sound would reverberate through the building. And if a child let go of the bed frame during the beating, they'd start the count over at 1. The first blow lifted me 1.5 feet off that bed, recalls Dick Cooper, another survivor. And every time that strap would come down, you could hear the shuffle on the concrete because their shoes would slide, and you could hear the swoosh, swoosh, bam. They'd turn on a massive industrial fan to drown out the screams, the same fan that made it hard for the children to breathe in that damp, stinking hellhole. Children as young as 8 years old were reportedly subjected to brutal punishment in the White House. Let that sink in. 8-year-olds being beaten by grown men employed by the state of Florida. The mattress was soaked with urine from terrified children. Blood stained the walls. And when the beating was over, they dumped the broken, bleeding child outside the back door like garbage. Here's what's going to make you absolutely lose your mind. They all knew, every single one of them. From the very beginning, government officials, politicians, and investigators knew exactly what was happening at Dozier, and they chose to do nothing. Let's go through the litany of willful blindness. 1903. Investigators find children in leg irons. Report says it's a prison, not a reform school. Response: change the superintendent. 1914. A fire kills an estimated 6 to 10 boys and 2 staff members. The grand jury finds that the superintendent and staff were in town on a pleasure bent when the fire started. Fire escapes were locked, trapping children inside. Response: fire the superintendent, keep the school open. 1934, a 13-year-old boy sent there for trespassing dies 38 days after arriving. 38 days. Response: shrug shoulders, keep operating. 1968, Governor Claude Kirk visits and finds holes in leaking ceilings, broken walls, bucket toilets, overcrowding, no heat in winter. He says, if one of your kids were kept in such circumstances, you'd be up there with rifles. An official from the U.S. Department of Health calls it a monstrosity. Response: outlaw corporal punishment on paper, continue the abuse behind closed doors. 1982, investigators find boys hogtied and kept in isolation for weeks at a time. Response: the ACLU files a lawsuit, school keeps operating. Do you see the pattern here? Investigation after investigation, report after report, politician after politician expressing shock and outrage, and then nothing. The school just kept grinding up children year after year, decade after decade. According to the University of South Florida's research, the school was investigated by the state 6 times during its first 13 years alone. 6 times. And it stayed open for 98 more years after that. The death toll at Dozier is staggering, and even today, we don't know the full scope of it. According to University of South Florida research, approximately 98 boys died between 1914 and 1973. But here's the kicker. They buried many of them in unmarked graves and kept inadequate records on purpose. The cemetery was called Boot Hill, a name that should tell you everything about how they viewed these children. not as human beings who deserve dignity and death, but as disposable nuisances. When forensic anthropologist Dr. Erin Kimmerle from the University of South Florida began investigating in 2012, she found 55 graves, 24 more than the official records indicated, 24 children who died and were buried without anyone bothering to keep proper records. Think about that. These kids died in state custody, and the state couldn't even be bothered to document where they buried the bodies. Dr. Kimmerle pointed out that state hospitals and prisons from the same era kept meticulous plat maps showing exactly where people were buried, but not Dozier. Why? Because they didn't want anyone looking too closely. 3 times as many black students died and were buried at Dozier compared to white students. The racism wasn't just in life. It followed these children to their graves. And here's something that will chill you to the bone. Researchers found evidence that some children died from gunshot wounds and blunt force trauma, not accidents, not illness, violence. If you thought the horrors I've described so far were bad, wait until you hear about the systematic racism that made everything worse for black children at Dozier. The school was segregated until 1966 with completely separate campuses. But it wasn't separate and equal. It was separate and deliberately worse for the black children. John Bonner, who survived Dozier, described it perfectly. On the white side, it was more roomy. You had the industrial shops, the woodworking shop, places the white boy was able to get a certificate. The black side was the slave side. Richard Huntley was 11 when he arrived at Dozier and spent 2 years there. While white boys were given vocational training, he and other black boys were forced to work in the fields, picking and planting for state profit. In his words, it was kind of like slavery, state-sanctioned, profit-driven slavery. Black boys did the most dangerous work, cutting sugarcane, clearing swamps, hauling heavy loads. Richard Huntley accidentally cut his toe nearly off while cutting sugarcane as a child. He received no proper medical care. They were forbidden from talking to white children under penalty of severe beatings. The segregation was enforced through violence and terror. And when they died, which they did at 3 times the rate of white children, they were even less likely to be properly documented or have their families notified. Some families never knew what happened to their children. You want to know the most infuriating part of this whole story? It's how the system protected itself every step of the way. Every time abuse was exposed, every time investigators found evidence of torture, every time journalists wrote damning exposés, the response was always the same. Promise reforms, maybe fire a superintendent, change the name of the place, and keep the machine of brutality running. Between 1903 and 1913, just the first 10 years, there were 6 state-led investigations that found evidence of children being chained, beaten, and used as forced labor. 6 investigations. And the school not only stayed open, but expanded. Why? Because Dozier was making money. It was profitable. The state was getting free labor from children to build roads, grow crops, and manufacture goods. Private companies were leasing child laborers. Politicians' cronies had jobs there. There was too much money involved to let a little thing like human decency get in the way. When Governor Claude Kirk visited in 1968 and found conditions so appalling he said parents would be up there with rifles if their own kids were kept that way, did he shut it down? No. He outlawed corporal punishment on paper and walked away. The beatings continued in secret. When the ACLU filed lawsuits in the 1980s after finding children hogtied and isolated for weeks, did the state shut it down? No. They settled the lawsuits and kept operating. The system was designed to protect itself, not the children. Every investigation was a performance. Every reform was theater. The real business, profiting off child suffering, continued uninterrupted. For decades, the survivors stayed silent. They were children when they experienced this trauma, and they carried the shame and terror with them into adulthood. Many believed no one would believe them. Others were threatened into silence. But in the early 2000s, something changed. Men who had survived Dozier began writing about their experiences online. Slowly, tentatively, they began to find each other. They called themselves the White House Boys, named after that concrete building where so many of them had been tortured. What started as a handful of men sharing their stories grew into a movement of over 400 survivors. At the center of this movement was a man named Jerry Cooper. Jerry was sent to Dozier in 1961 when he was 16 years old. He was the school's star quarterback, but that didn't protect him from the horrors that awaited in the White House. You didn't know when it was coming, Jerry told NPR years later. These were not spankings. These were beatings, brutal beatings. Jerry's story was particularly compelling because of the circumstances that led to his worst beating. Late one spring night in 1961, Jerry was taken to the White House not for any major infraction, but for refusing to play football. Think about that. A teenager beaten bloody because he didn't want to play a sport. But Jerry Cooper didn't just survive Dozier, he became its most relentless opponent. After retiring at 41 from a successful heavy machinery business in Maryland, Jerry made exposing the truth about Dozier his full-time mission. For 12 years, he served as president of the White House Boys organization, spending hours every day building what became an encyclopedic knowledge of the school's crimes. Jerry was willing to do whatever it took to prove the survivors were telling the truth. In 2009, he voluntarily took a polygraph test at his own expense to confirm his allegations were true. He passed. He had his scars photographed as evidence. He even challenged Troy Tidwell, the one-armed staff member who had beaten him, to take a lie detector test as well. Tidwell refused. What made Jerry particularly credible was his attention to detail and his willingness to share the most painful memories. He told investigators about working as a teacher's aide at Dozier, trying to teach kids who couldn't even write their own names. When those children would stand up from their chairs after class, Jerry would wipe their blood off the seats. It was nothing to him, he said years later. They all bled. Jerry appeared in dozens of television interviews. His plain-spoken outrage, combined with his wife Babs Cooper's empathy and networking skills, kept the White House Boys story in the public eye for more than a decade. He represented the survivors in major outlets like the BBC, the New York Times, The Guardian, and NPR. When Aaron Kimmerly announced the discovery of unmarked graves in December 2012, Jerry leaped out of his chair watching the news. He immediately reached out to Aaron Kimmerly, hobbling over to her with his cane after one of her press conferences offering his services. He became a clearinghouse of information, sending along stories from survivors, contacts, anything that might help uncover the truth. I had the privilege of meeting Jerry Cooper in 2017 and conducting a series of video interviews with him. What struck me most was how compelling and believable his story was. This wasn't a man seeking attention or money. This was someone carrying the weight of unspeakable trauma who had made it his mission to ensure no one could ever deny what happened at Dozier. Jerry's rage, and make no mistake, he carried a deep, justified rage about what was done to him and his fellow survivors, made him an ideal spokesperson for the 500 men who had been brutalized as children. His anger wasn't random or unfocused. It was laser-focused on accountability, on truth, on making sure the world knew what the state of Florida had done to children for over a century. Sadly, Jerry Cooper died in May 2022 at the age of 76, still fighting for full justice for his fellow survivors. But his legacy lives on in the compensation fund that was finally passed in 2024 and in the memorial that now stands where the White House once operated. Roger Kaiser was one of the first to speak out, writing about his experiences at the school in the late 50s. Dick Cooper shared his story of being beaten at 2 in the morning. Robert Straley described the blood-stained mattress and the sound of the leather strap. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic torture carried out by multiple staff members over multiple decades. The White House boys didn't want money initially. They wanted recognition. They wanted acknowledgement that these atrocities had happened. They wanted the world to know that the state of Florida had operated a torture chamber for children for over a century. In 2009, the Tampa Bay Times published an expose that brought national attention to the survivors' stories. Finally, the world was listening. But even then, the state's response was pathetic. Governor Charlie Crist ordered an investigation by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. After 15 months and over 100 interviews, what did they conclude? That they couldn't find concrete evidence linking student deaths to staff actions. They didn't want to find evidence. They didn't want to acknowledge the scope of the crimes, because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that the state of Florida had been complicit in child abuse for over a century. What finally broke the state's wall of denial wasn't testimony from survivors. It was the bodies. But here's what will make you absolutely furious. The state of Florida fought tooth and nail to prevent those bodies from ever being found. When Dr. Aaron Kimmerly, a forensic anthropologist from the University of South Florida, who had worked on war crimes investigations for the United Nations, learned about Dozier in 2011, she was struck by the similarities to international cases of mass atrocities. She applied for permission to conduct archaeological research at the site. Using ground-penetrating radar and archaeological techniques, her team found 55 graves where the state claimed there were only 31. They found evidence of hasty burials. They found bodies wrapped only in shrouds, dumped in the ground without coffins or proper burial practices. But here's where it gets truly infuriating. When Dr. Kimmerl tried to get permission to excavate those graves, to identify those children so their families could finally have answers, the state of Florida said no. Let me name some names here because these people need to be remembered for their obstruction of justice. Ken Detzner, Florida's Secretary of State under Governor Rick Scott, repeatedly refused to grant the permits needed for excavation. When Dr. Kimmerl applied for permission to exhume the bodies, Detzner's office first asked her to withdraw the application. When she refused, they asked for more information. When she provided that information, they still refused to grant permission. Detzner claimed that his office did not have the statutory authority to authorize the excavation of human remains. This was a complete lie. As civil rights leader Robert Landry pointed out after meeting with Detzner personally, human remains are historic. He's playing a game of double talk. Think about that. The state of Florida was arguing that children buried in unmarked graves on state property weren't historically significant enough to warrant investigation. Children who died in state custody, children whose families had been denied answers for decades. The NAACP was extremely angry, as Landry put it. We're talking about a site where there were atrocities done in America on state property on both black and white boys. Dr. Kimmerl had to fight through the courts. She worked with medical examiner Michael Hunter and Attorney General Pam Bondi to petition a Jackson County judge for permission. Even the judge, Judge William L. Wright, pointed out that they already had the proper permits and legal authority to perform the excavations, but Detzner kept blocking it. The man who worked directly under Governor Rick Scott kept finding excuses to prevent the truth from coming out. Senator Bill Nelson called it what it was, a classic runaround. He said, "This is state-owned land. It's the state's responsibility, and the state of Florida needs to do the right thing and not pass the buck." Finally, Dr. Kimmerl had to make an end run around Detzner. She appealed directly to the Board of Trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund, which consisted of Governor Rick Scott, Attorney General Pam Bondi, Chief Financial Officer Jeff Atwater, and Agriculture Commissioner Adam Putnam. On August 6, 2013, after months of bureaucratic stonewalling, the board finally voted to allow the excavation to proceed. Why did they finally approve it? Because they knew the evidence was going to come out anyway, and they wanted to control the narrative. As one source noted, Detzner had privately told people he was glad USF wanted to lead the investigation because otherwise the state might have to do it themselves. Most damning of all, the forensic evidence Dr. Kimmerly finally uncovered showed some children had died from blunt force trauma and gunshot wounds. One child's remains showed evidence of a projectile, a bullet, though Dr. Kimmerl couldn't determine if it was a factor in the death. The forensic evidence confirmed what the White House boys had been saying all along. Children were dying from violence at Dozier, and the state was covering it up. Dr. Kimmerly's research also revealed the racist nature of the deaths. Black children died at 3 times the rate of white children. They were less likely to be named in death records. Their families were less likely to be notified. One of the first remains to be identified was George Owen Smith, who was 14 when he disappeared in 1940. His mother wrote to the superintendent asking about her son. She was told no one knew where he was. Later, she was told he died trying to escape. When the family came to claim his body, they were shown an unmarked grave. His sister, Oval Krell, said their mother never accepted that her son was dead and spent the rest of her life waiting for him to come home. Multiply that story by dozens of families who never got answers about their children, who disappeared into the earth at Dozier. And remember, the state of Florida tried to make sure those families would never get answers. Ken Detzner and Rick Scott's administration fought for months to keep those children buried and forgotten in unmarked graves. They didn't want the truth to come out. They didn't want families to have closure. They wanted the evidence to stay buried forever. It took until 2011 for the Dozier School to finally close, not because of moral outrage, not because politicians finally developed consciences, because of budget constraints. After the U.S. Department of Justice conducted their own investigation and found ongoing excessive force and constitutional violations, Florida didn't shut down Dozier out of shame. They shut it down to save money. 111 years of torture, and it ended with an accounting spreadsheet. But the White House boys didn't give up. They kept fighting for recognition, for accountability, for some acknowledgement of the horrors they'd endured. In 2017, the Florida legislature finally passed a resolution apologizing to the survivors. It was a start, but words are cheap. The real victory came in 2024 when the legislature passed a $20 million compensation fund for survivors of both Dozier and its sister school in Okeechobee. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough, but it was something. Over 800 survivors applied for compensation, 800 men who had been tortured as children by the state of Florida and spent decades fighting just to be believed. As I'm recording this, the White House still stands on the former Dozier campus. The state has turned it into a memorial, complete with statues depicting what the boys experienced: a blood-stained bed, the paddle used to beat them, the industrial fan used to drown out their screams. It's a nice gesture, I suppose, but memorials are for the dead. Many of these survivors are still alive, still carrying the trauma of what was done to them. Charles Fudge, president of the White House boys, is 76 years old. He's been fighting for recognition for 16 years. "This is time sensitive," he said recently. "You take a look at us, folks. We're old people. Numerous have died already. They're running out of time. These men who survived hell as children are dying as elderly men, many without ever seeing full justice for what was done to them. Because here's what really makes me angry. No one was ever held criminally responsible. Not one staff member, not one administrator, not one politician who knew and looked the other way. They all got to live their lives free from consequences while their victims carried the trauma forever. The state of Florida operated a concentration camp for children for over a century, and the response has been a memorial plaque and a compensation fund that most survivors will die before receiving. This isn't ancient history. Dozier closed in 2011. There are staff members from that place still alive today. There are politicians who knew about the abuse still holding office, and the attitudes that allowed Dozier to operate for so long are still with us. The willingness to look the other way when poor children, minority children, troubled children are being abused. The assumption that some kids deserve whatever happens to them. We tell ourselves that something like Dozier could never happen today, but children are still being abused in state facilities right now. They're being trafficked, exploited, and brutalized while politicians make speeches about protecting children. The only difference is that now we're better at hiding it. Johnny Lee Gaddy was 11 years old when he was sent to Dozier for the crime of skipping school because he had a speech impediment and was tired of being teased. 11 years old, for truancy. He spent 4 years there working in fields, cutting timber, being beaten bloody in the White House. It was exactly what it was designed to be from the very beginning, a way to exploit children for profit while wrapping it in the language of rehabilitation and reform. The Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys was one of the most successful public-private partnerships in Florida history. It just happened to be built on the torture and exploitation of children. So what's the takeaway from this century of horror? What are we supposed to learn from the story of Dozier? First, that evil isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always come with mustaches to twirl and obvious villains. Sometimes evil comes dressed as reform. Sometimes it comes with good intentions and noble language. Sometimes evil comes wearing a government badge and collecting a steady paycheck. Second, that institutions will always protect themselves before they protect the vulnerable. Every investigation, every reform, every promise of change at Dozier was designed to make the problem go away, not to actually solve it. Third, that the willingness to dehumanize children, especially poor children, black children, troubled children, runs deep in our society. It's easy to torture people once you've convinced yourself they're not really people. And finally, that survivors are more resilient than their abusers ever imagined. The White House boys didn't just survive Dozier, they survived decades of being ignored, dismissed, and disbelieved. They kept fighting for truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. They turned their trauma into a force for change. They made sure the world would never forget what was done to them. The state of Florida owes a debt to these men that can never be fully repaid. A debt measured not just in money, but in stolen childhoods, in lifelong trauma, in broken families, in trust that can never be restored. But the least we can do, the absolute least, is remember their stories and say their names. We need to make sure that the world knows what happened at the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys. Because forgetting is the final insult. Forgetting is how it happens again. The White House boys didn't survive hell just to have their stories forgotten. They survived to bear witness. They survived to testify. They survived to make sure that no other child would ever suffer what they suffered. The Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys. Opened from January 1st, 1900 to June 30th, 2011. 111 years of state-sanctioned child abuse. 111 years of profit made from suffering. 111 years of politicians looking the other way. Remember that name. Remember those boys. Remember that this happened in America, in Florida, in our lifetime. And remember that the only reason we know about it is because the survivors refused to let us forget. This podcast was based on research from the University of South Florida Forensic Investigations led by Dr. Aaron Kimmerly, testimonies from White House boys, survivors, historical records from the Florida State Archives, investigative reporting by the Tampa Bay Times, NPR, and other outlets, research by genealogist Antoinette Harrell on peonage practices, Florida Department of Law Enforcement investigations, and the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division reports. For more information about the White House boys and their ongoing fight for justice, visit the official whitehouseboys.org. I'm Joel Chandler. Thank you for listening to another episode of Unsealed. Remember, the truth dies in the dark.